getting up on the forum page, and we're starting to look good where we need to be. I've also put a bit of a link on the website with the whiskies where the samples I've sent out, but I'm encouraging a lot of people, if you've got anything Japanese written on it at home, feel free to crack that open so we might get a few people drinking a few different things. But I can see us live in a few places, so I'm thinking we're pretty good. So to the people sitting into the Zoom chat, to the people watching us on Facebook at whiskyfair.com.au/forum, to people watching at oakbarrel.com.au/live, welcome everyone to a very, very special panel, our second panel of the night, on night 2 of the Sydney Whisky Forum. My name is Scott Fitzsimons from the Oak Barrel. It's my great pleasure to welcome in Stefan, our Japanese whiskey expert for tonight, live from Tokyo in Japan. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And a warm welcome, literally, to everyone listening, because I'm here in Tokyo. Of course, it's the middle of the summer now. So if you hear a little buzz in the background, that's my air conditioner battling the heat. It's been a toasty 35 degrees today. So I envy you for your weather at the moment.
Well, we do like it quite warm, particularly here in Sydney. Down in Melbourne, I think it's a bit cold. We actually had some snow out west, so we're not completely opposed to a bit of warm weather at the moment. But g'day to Matt and Andrew in the Zoom chat. We've got people listening on the Facebook as well. To Gavin, who already jumps in and says awesome book on this one. But yes, I mean let's jump right in. Stefan, from I'm going to get you to do a bit of an intro for yourself. But for me personally, you've been, I think, living in Japan for about 2 decades now. Been an authority on Japanese whiskey from your time with the Nonjatta blog, then writing the book Whisky Rising, which is a bit of my Bible here whenever I need to refer to anything. But on a personal level, you've been someone for me who I've been able to reach out to over the past years and say, hey, I don't know anything about this. Can you help me out? It's just an absolute pleasure to have you on the stream. We've always talked about getting you into the back room here at the Oak Barrel, and the times just haven't quite lined up. And there's no time that lines up in 2020. So it's great to finally, essentially your debut at the Oak Barrel, even though it's not quite, but I'm going to count a virtual debut as a debut. But yeah, I guess, I mean, how have you been? How does a whiskey author and consultant spend his time during a global pandemic?
So usually, actually, during the summer, I hate Japanese summers because they're excruciatingly hot, very humid. And because I work in music education, I have a very long summer break, a month and a half, 2 months. And so usually I spend my summer traveling around with my family and usually visiting distilleries in other countries. And then I write about, say, bourbon distilleries or rum distilleries in Hawaii and so on for Whiskey Magazine Japan in Japanese. So that's usually how I spend my summers. But it's been a very uneventful, very boring summer now, especially because unlike say places like the UK, or what I see in Australia, in the United States as well, where there are a lot of online events being held, online tastings, seminars, and so on. There's very little of that sort happening in Japan. In Japanese. So I envy my friends abroad for all the events that they're able to attend online, in spite of these tough times.
Yeah. I mean, to people who maybe are unfamiliar with you or know you only as the author of the book or behind on, do you want to give it a quick rundown of what got you to move to Japan in the first place, and then what essentially got you in and fascinated you about Japanese whiskey?
Before moving to Japan in late 2000, I was living in Edinburgh, and I was teaching music at the University of Edinburgh. And there was a special program, a fellowship that was being offered, and this was mostly for senior academics. So I had very little hope, but that was there's a lot of money attached to it for a year, to spend a year in Japan studying whatever field you were interested in. So I decided to apply for that as kind of a year's break. And then I panicked a little bit when I got awarded the fellowship, and I thought, okay, now I have to make the trip out there. And so then I moved to Japan, and I thought, okay, a year later I'll be back in Edinburgh, enjoying whiskey, visiting distilleries and so on, being immersed in whiskey. But then I met someone here, and a year turned into a little bit more and a little bit more, and then got married, had kids, and so on. And so long story short, 20 years later, I'm still here. But the first couple of years after I moved to Japan, I thought I just moved to a desert, in terms of whiskey, because no one was talking about Japanese whiskey in those days. Distilleries were ghost towns, even the bigger distilleries, the big boys. I won't name them, but they were making whiskey maybe one day a week just to keep the equipment in order. And then I started visiting some distilleries in the margin of just travels with my girlfriend at the time. But and then I discovered little by little that there was this high quality whiskey around, and people didn't have a high opinion of it here in Japan. So either people just drank cheap stuff that you can buy in 4-liter plastic bottles in the supermarket, just utilitarian whiskey, so to speak, or else specialist whiskey bars. It was all about Scotch and to a lesser extent bourbon, but people didn't have a high opinion of Japanese whiskey. And so in retrospect, those were the good days, because you could get anything you wanted any day. I remember going to Yasato Distillery, and basically you had single casks lined up there from every vintage of production. And what the guys there used to do, they would just go into the warehouse, tap into a cask and fill 20 bottles and put that in the shop. And when those were gone, they would, fill some more and so on. Or, you could go to a store, like a big electronics store all over Japan, and you could buy a Suntory, single cask whiskey any day of the week. So those were the good old days,
Yeah, I mean, there's a real, temptation to talk about the history and, where we got to here, because a lot's happened in the past 5 years, let alone the last little while. But that's why, I'd probably lean towards people to go and buy a copy of Whisky Rising, because that's mapped out. I'd like to talk about the future with you tonight. Just in a second, we'll get onto that. But just maybe to wrap that up, in the past, couple of decades of your time in Japan, we've seen it from an external point of view, how seismic has been the change of not only, the recognition of Japanese whiskey, but like the culture domestically as well.
That's a good question. There's been a huge change. I remember that even as recently as 9-8 years ago, visiting liquor shops where you would have Ichiro's Card Series bottles with the labels falling off because no one was buying them. And Ichiro, just after he'd set up Chichibu, was selling about 100 casks to raise some cash at a price for which now, on the secondary market, that's the price for one bottle of that same Chichibu. And even serious collectors in Japan, and I've asked some of these guys, so they would help interested collectors abroad getting all these interesting Japanese bottlings like 10 years ago and so on. And I said, why didn't you buy any for yourself? Like, all those Ichiro's cards and Karuizawas and stuff like that. And, and the answer is they weren't interested. There was very little interest in Japan. But of course, now that pendulums swung to the other side, and sometimes a little bit, uncritically so, what I mean is that people just jump on everything that's put out nowadays, regardless of quality. I guess, that's inevitable. That's just the way of life, right? So people regret stuff they didn't do and they should have done it, and then try to compensate.
Yeah. Hindsight's a great thing. I mean, like a lot of this is covered in your book. So let's look at now. And 2020, you've put together like a great little slideshow that I'll bring up now. But 2020 was supposed to be, like, again, looking at it externally, as a really breakout year for Japanese whiskey with the Olympics. I was hearing rumors of special releases, some very old stuff, some new stuff, new series coming online. No Olympics. Is everything on hold, or what's the feeling like there at the moment?
I mean, most whiskey companies, most distilleries are delaying, but most of them are playing their cards very close to their chest, and I try to get some information out of them. But it's very difficult to get them to say anything. But clearly, some of them had some big releases lined up. For example, for Chichibu, their first 10-year-old, which it looks like it is coming. And then some other companies that plan some commemorative editions for the Olympics. So whether they can wait until next year, it's very tricky. Like there's one distillery, I won't name it, but there's one distillery that had some older casks, just a few 28-year-old, 29-year-old, 30-year-old casks left. For them, waiting another year is taking a little bit of a risk. So so it's possible that these things have been bottled and they're just waiting to roll them out later. Various strategies, I think.
A quick g'day from Ben Sochin on the Facebook chat. I know he's a good friend of yours and mine.
Yes, hi Ben.
Quickly, just before we jump into it, a good question from Matt Bailey, who's the Scotch Malt Whisky Society ambassador in Australia. We've seen this sort of lock of Japanese whiskey, just sort of on you were saying there about people waiting for releases. Are there still big challenges for Japanese whiskey in the next 10 years, or is there about to be an influx of releases, do you think?
It's hard to imagine, like here on the ground in Japan, that things will change over the next couple of years. So I saw that there was a Highwayman release yesterday or something like that. And people were saying, 25 minutes. But here in Japan, when there's a new release, we're talking about like a split second and everything's gone. And that's the climate at the moment. It's very difficult to get hold of anything. And in some instances, it's easier abroad, in a sense. But so it's difficult to imagine this changing in the short term. But certainly the bigger producers, they're talking about 2030, that by then they will have solved the issue of supply. So Suntory, Nikka, they're building extra warehouses. For example, Nikka, they're switching back to a 2-shift system at their distilleries, which they hadn't done for the past 25 years. There's big changes at Fuji Gotemba as well, which is being renamed Mount Fuji Distillery, and so on. But so maybe 10 years from now it'll be easier, but who knows?
Yeah. I guess that's the big thing. We don't know what's going to happen, as we didn't know what's going to happen in 2020, let alone in the next 10 years. So I'm going to bring this up now, and so I hope this works and you can sort of see it, and I hope everyone can sort of see that. But you've put together basically a collection of new distilleries with some photos from them. And certainly there's distilleries that us in Australia won't have seen too much of. There's obviously a lot out there, and if I actually go to the second map, we can see just how many there are. Out of the ones you chose to showcase and talk about tonight, what was it about those ones that made you say, okay, this is worth talking about?
I think basically quality and vision. So when I arrived here in 2000, there were 7 distilleries, active distilleries. And now, if you look at the list, it's kind of small, maybe difficult to see. But now we're approaching 30, and many of them in various stages of development as well that aren't on the map even. And so, obviously, Chichibu was a critical one, founded in 2007. So you have to keep in mind that the high point of domestic whiskey consumption in Japan was 1983, 1984, and after that you had a 25-year decline of whiskey consumption. So when Ichiro decided to set up a distillery, it'd be kind of the equivalent of someone telling you nowadays that they were going to put all their money and dedicate their life to producing cassette tape players or something like that. People thought he was out of his mind. And then, so after Chichibu, you have this first, what I call the first post-Chichibu wave, and they're often called Ichiro's children in Japan, of distilleries who were inspired by this example of Chichibu after a couple of years, right, after 2-3 years, and then decided that maybe it wasn't such a crazy idea to set up a distillery after all. And so that's the kind of the first wave. And then distilleries established between 2014, 2017, roughly. And then the second wave of distilleries that were encouraged by the example of these first wave post-Chichibu distilleries. And so the first wave ones are, I've picked a few, just I think 2 or 3 that have just released their first proper whiskey. Now, when I say proper whiskey in Japan, there's no regulation as far as age is concerned. So on the day it's produced, it's whiskey. But the serious craft producers, they abide by the Scottish regulation of 3 years, and then it's proper whiskey, even though they don't have to. And so the first one is Asaka Distillery.
Stefan, just there. I'd encourage anyone who we're going to roll through these distilleries now. So if you've got a couple of the Chichibu samples at home or anything Japanese open, just have a drink along with us and ask any questions. I'll keep monitoring. But we'll start rolling through the distilleries that you want to talk about.
Yep. So this one, Asaka Distillery, as you can see, it's not a very pretty distillery, but they've got a very long history as a company. So they were founded in 1765. And it's about 2 hours northeast of Tokyo on the bullet train in a city called Koriyama, and so they are a sake producer mainly. But after the Second World War, they started dabbling in whiskey. There was a rice scarcity, but huge demand for whiskey from the Allied occupation in Japan. And at the moment, at that point in time, there was a system of first class, second class, and third class whiskey, which was later changed to special grade, first grade, and second grade. And they specialized in the lowest grade, which is cheap swill. And this was linked to percentages of authentic malt in the composition of the whiskey. And you have to keep in mind that this wasn't made with grain whiskey, but just with neutral spirit. And so for the lowest grade whiskeys, it was between 0 and 3%. Authentic whiskey in the blend, right? So basically, you could just have neutral spirit with coloring and flavoring and call it whiskey. But anyway, and so they dabbled in whiskey in those years, and basically the structure of the company allowed that because they're a sake producer, so they're busy 200 days a year, but during the remaining 150 years, they don't have any work. So during the hot summer months, they don't have any work. So they thought, well, we can make whiskey during those 150 days. But then when their 250th anniversary came up, they decided to set up a proper distillery. And the president of the company is a very close friend of Ichiro. So he got a lot of advice from Ichiro. They ordered some stills from a local coppersmith in Japan called Miyake, because the lead time at Forsyth was 4 years. And so it's a very small distillery with everything taking place under one roof. So you see in the picture on the left-hand side, so the mill is just hand-fed, so bags of 25 kilos hand-fed into the mill. Very small pot stills, so 2,000 liters for wash still, 1,000 liters for the spirit still. These animal tanks that were used for sake before as washbacks. And basically it's two young people making whiskey. The girl actually, when she started making whiskey, there was 18 years old. And so the drinking age in Japan is 20. So she couldn't even taste what she was making. She can now. But so very hands-on. You see her there cleaning the mash tun. And I don't know.
There seems to be a lot of distilleries, also like sake breweries who have dabbled in whiskey who are now doing a little bit more. Are there many sake breweries that are getting into whiskey for the first time at the moment?
Most of them have, a history of making whiskey, but when I say making whiskey, it's basically using any means necessary, and everything was legal, because of a lack of strict regulations. So it wasn't very good whiskey. So they're mostly producers who, in the post-war years, and then especially in the 70s and 80s, when whiskey production was at an all-time high in Japan, were just making very cheap and quite frankly not very pleasant whiskeys. If you find bottles from that period now. And so at the time it was called G whiskey, as in local whiskey. Kind of like crafty whiskeys using colorings, flavorings, mostly neutral spirit, bulk imported malt to add in small doses and things like that. So that kind of the crafty distillery period. Nowadays, obviously, provenance, transparency and all that for a craft producer is very important. So they don't do that sort of thing anymore. And so they make whiskey in a serious way, for lack of a better word. And so this distillery, it's there's these two guys making whiskey, an incredible attention to detail there at the distillery. Everything's in their hands. They're very aware of very tiny changes. They prepare the yeast themselves in these orange buckets that you see there. They know a certain number of times to stir, et cetera, et cetera. And so I spent a couple of days with these people. And in Japan, there's a belief that there's a relationship between blood type and personality type. It's a cultural thing. And so I asked these people what about their blood type, and it turns out they were all A types. And in Japan, people believe that people with the blood type A are very fastidious, very precise, attention to detail, a little bit anal. So I'm blood type A, by the way. And this is their first release, which I don't know. Has this reached Australia?
We've seen Yamazakura as a brand. I've seen that around, but I can't say I've seen the first. I don't know if anyone in the audience might have. But yeah, not as far as I'm aware.
Yep. I think it's a little bit unfortunate because Yamazakura is a range under which they also release quite a few whiskeys that are basically blends of bulk import whiskey. So I was hoping they maybe would have picked a different brand for their own in-house single malt, but doesn't seem to be the case. So it's Yamazakura. And so since Ichiro, since Chichibu, there's a bit of a tradition among craft producers after 3 years to release your, distillery the first. So this is Asaka the first, which was released, I think, towards the end of last year. And I think this is just very promising. So if you have the chance to get hold of a bottle of this, quite light, a lot of notes of like, cotton candy, some bubble gum, kind of, light fruity notes, but very pleasant and very promising. Most of what they make is non-peated, but for one month a year they make heavily peated whiskey. Yeah. So this is one to watch. I think.
I find that quite interesting. And a quick g'day to Yao Wong from the Elysian Bar, who's watching it on the Facebook as well. But that's a really interesting point, because I know that Yamazakura, was a different style, and then they come out with this. And there's been a few questions come through on the Zoom chat here about, does Japanese whiskey need an SWA, a Scotch Whisky Association, to try and create some regulations? And as you were saying before, there are, the people doing it for the right reasons will hold themselves to those regulations. But are there any tips or tricks for someone in Australia who doesn't have the benefit of having you standing next to them at a bottle store, and they see 2 bottles of Yamazakura? How can we tell the provenance of these bottles? Is there any way? In the case of Yamazakura, it says for their own in-house malt, it says single malt, Japanese single malt whiskey, whereas usually when it's bulk import whiskey, it'll say pure malt or something like that. And there are many ways to confuse consumers, because there's no definition of pure malt in Japan, obviously. But it's very difficult. So basically, you need to do a lot of research to find out whether a distillery is making this stuff from scratch, or whether they're using bulk imported whiskey. And it's a huge can of worms, because some of these distilleries who do it and who use tactics that I personally don't like, because they use iconography that screams Japan, and they use very vague wording and so on to mislead the consumer. They say, well, we're not breaking any laws, and everyone in Japan is using bulk import whiskey, which is true. There's most of the producers, both the big producers and the small producers, are using bulk import whiskey in one way or another.
but many of them are, of course, well, the better ones are transparent about that. So do we need those regulations? I think so. But will it happen? Personally, I think it'll take a bit longer than people are hoping for. Change in Japan tends to be slow. And what people forget is that many producers, not only the small craft producers, but the big boys too, have a vested interest in there not being too many rules. Because obviously you can regulate one particular aspect, say, using bulk import whiskey. But then you can't import just one aspect without, you can't just regulate one aspect without regulating all, other aspects that are related. So what about the minimum age? Will that have to be regulated? And so say the big producers who are, selling, the cheaper whiskeys in Japan for the domestic market that are not exported, and that probably don't have 3 years of aging under their belt or even 2 years. Will the big producers want a sort of landscape in which the whiskeys that they're selling most of in their home market suddenly aren't Japanese whiskeys anymore, because they don't meet those particular requirements that are set maybe with craft producers or maybe with the specialist whiskey drinker in mind, rather than the casual whiskey drinker, which is where the big companies make most of their money. So a lot of different companies have different vested interests in not regulating too many things. So that's why I have to be very careful here and pick my words carefully, but in regulating some of these things. And, say a small craft producer selling whiskey that pretends to be Japanese, even though it uses bulk imported whiskey, the big boys don't lose any sleep over that. That's not a dent in their profit at all. So it's a very complex issue. But of course, my personal opinion is that there should be regulations, just as in any other major whiskey producing country around the world. So.
Yeah. But speaking of people doing it correctly and definitely Japanese whiskey, we're about to move on to one of my favorite new Japanese whiskey. So I've been lucky enough to try the new make a few years ago. And for me, the best, I haven't tried a lot of Japanese new make, but this is the best new make, Tanuki from right down south.
Yeah. Tanuki is a great distillery. So this Hombo Shizo is the company. And again, they've got a background in sake making, shochu production, even like forest management and things like that. So they surprised people when they announced towards the end of 2015 that they were setting up a second distillery, because this was seen. So as most people know, in Japan, there's no swapping of stock in Japan. So having two distilleries was kind of seen as a prerogative of the big boys. Like Suntory has two big malt distilleries. Nika has two big malt distilleries. But for a craft producer to have two distilleries, that was kind of unheard of, and many people were surprised at the time. And so a young guy, so Tatsuro Kusano is the master distiller there. He spent a couple of years at Mars's other distillery, Shinshu, which is more northeast on the map. It's very small. I don't know if people can see it. But very interesting guy with very interesting ideas of his own. And you will see this like throughout the pictures that you will see. So there's a new generation of whiskey makers being raised in Japan at the moment. So most of these people are in their late 20s, early 30s, because basically there is no previous generation of craft distillers. So this bodes well for the future. So for example, this is one of the interesting things that he's doing. And I'm not sure that in Scotland, you're able to do this, probably not. But so this is the inside of a washback. And as you can see, there's a bunch of staves there. These are American white oak staves hanging in the washback. Obviously, this is not to impart flavor, which wouldn't happen anyway, but it's to encourage the lactic fermentation stage. And so this is one of his little ideas. But he's got so many things that he's exploring at Tanuki Distillery. So it's 1 ton batch, but he moved to 1.1 ton so that he can use 100 grams of specialty malts and experiment with that. So that's another thing that he's doing. And various types of yeast, distiller's yeast, but then also various kind of beer yeasts, shochu yeasts, things like that. So that's the inside of the distillery. Warm tubs, as you can see, so a heavier style of whiskey.
Are there any other distilleries using worm tubs in Japan as the condenser?
Well, Hakushu, I would have to check. Suntory has a few stills in their distilleries that use worm tubs. But among the craft producers, I think Kanosuke is using worm tubs as well, which actually 40 kilometers down the road from Tsunuki Distillery. No other ones spring to mind now, but yeah. He's also trying a lot of things in maturation department. So on the next slide, you can see. I mean, obviously they're just casks and they don't tell you anything, but they have 3 aging locations. So they've got their Shinshu Distillery, which is in the southern Alps in Japan, so mountain environment. Then they've got Tsunuki Distillery, obviously, which is further south. And then Yakushima, which is a subtropical island 60 kilometers south of Tsunuki, which is a World Heritage Site. And, subtropical, it rains a lot there. People say it rains 35 days a month there. Very humid. So they also have a little aging cellar there with room for just, a couple hundred casks, 400 casks. And so they send the new make that they make at Tsunuki to do those 3 locations. Well, they keep some at Tsunuki and then send some to the other 2 locations. And they do the same thing with the new make from Shinshu Distillery. But in the pictures, you can also see, for example, the Tsunuki aging picture, top left. Those are cherry wood heads, those casks. So the kind of brown reddish cask heads. The ones at the bottom are casks that were previously used for umeshu, which is a sort of plum liqueur. So I was doing a lot of different things, and they just released Tsunuki the First, which is one of my favorite whiskeys of the year. Just brilliant. If you have the chance to buy this in Australia or try it at a bar, this is a must try.
So just on that, it's a yes and no thing, unfortunately, for Australia. There's a little parcel that came in through Deja Vu, who import all the Mars stuff. I had actually fallen off that mailing list, one of those weird quirks of email. So by the time I found out that it had been offered, it was all gone. So I'm a little bit heartbroken about that, because I love the new make and tried it very early on, but it is out there somewhere. I don't know where. It might be at bars, might be in other retailers. But if you're in Australia looking for it, get on Google and always keep your eye out, because they're somewhere, but they are here at the moment somewhere. Stefan, are you there? Or have I dropped out? I might have dropped out there. Hey, Stefan?
Yep.
Sorry, I think I dropped out there. Had a glitch quickly.
Okay.
Sorry, but yeah, continue on.
So this has been one of the highlights. Very complex. I think they also used in the composition some whiskey that was matured in some of those casks with cherry wood heads. Obviously, you can't isolate that in this product, but I've tasted some whiskeys matured in casks with cherry heads, and what you get is a very lush kind of caramel sauce note from that particular wood. So, but yeah, very, very beautiful whiskey if you have the chance to try it.
Yeah, so I don't know if many people caught me there. It's just regarding, it is in Australia somewhere. Unfortunately, we missed out on it, but I don't know, bars or retailers, it's somewhere. But yeah, go and hunt it down. But I unfortunately can't give you too much more information on exactly where it is in Australia. Moving on to the next one is one I'm not familiar with.
Shizuoka Distillery. So this is about 2 hours on the bullet train southwest of Tokyo, between Tokyo and Nagoya. Very, very interesting distillery. So the guy who founded the distillery, Nakamura-san, he visited Scotland in 2012 and was very impressed when it was his first visit to Scotland. And at Kilchoman, he had this moment and said, oh, wow, I want to do something like this. And then he started planning his distillery, talked to Ichiro, and he said the best piece of advice that Ichiro gave him was, you can't pursue setting up a distillery in a sequential way. You can't say, okay, I'll find my site. And then once I have my site, I'll commission my stills. And then once I have my stills, I'll do this and that. He said, basically, you have to pursue everything at once and just hope that everything falls into place. And fortunately, it did for him, for Nakamura-san. And this is also a rare example in Japan of a distillery, of a craft distillery that was set up with the visitor experience in mind. So he's used a very good architect for this. And so everything's set up, obviously with ease of movement for the production staff, but also with the visitor experience in mind. And so he was lucky that Karuizawa Distillery was going to be demolished in early 2016. So a few months before that, he put the winning bid in for all of the equipment at the old Karuizawa Distillery, which was a bargain. And so he got, what you see there is the Porteous Mill, which came from Karuizawa Distillery. And, you know, this is nothing special when you're in Scotland. You know, you take pictures of Porteous Mills everywhere. But in Japan, that's actually the only one that you can see. There's two more at Hakushu Distillery and Yamazaki Distillery, but, you know, they're away from the public eye. So quite rare. And the de-stoner and so on from Karuizawa Distillery there. You can see in the warehouse some of the stills that couldn't be used because the copper was just too thin and they were worn out. But he kept them as little museum pieces in one of his warehouses. And the picture on the right with the stills, so you can see there's two brand new stills for sites on the left-hand side. So the wash still, which is one of the rare examples in the world of a wash still that's wood-fired. I think there's a small distillery in Mount Vernon, which is a seasonal distillery that does that, but you know it's very rare. And then so both of them have a bulge, as you can see. I asked Nakamura-san about that, and he said, "Oh, it's just because I love whiskeys made at distilleries where the stills have a bulge." And then you can see the old Karuizawa still, which is, you know, the third one from the left with the very long line arm. And then you see another still on the right, a small still, which he was going to use to make gin, but he kind of missed the boat on that because there's so many gin distilleries in Japan now. So he's thinking of using it for some other sort of purpose. But so the interesting thing here is that, so he's got the wash still that's wood-fired, and then he's got the Karuizawa still, which is also used as a wash still. And so he has two different types of distillates. So there on the left, you can see the wood-fired wash still. Two types of distillate, and I've tried them, and they're very different. And then the wonderful thing is, if you mix, obviously they keep the distillate separate and they age it separately and so on. But if you blend it, you get something that's more than the sum of its parts, so that, you know, he's got something to play with there as well. That's a picture of Nakamura-san on the right behind the Karuizawa still.
I've got quite a nerdy question for you there from someone, from Andy Milne, who spent a lot of time in Scotland and England before jumping over to Australia. And if you don't know the answer to this, I won't hold it against you. But who's servicing those Porteous mills in Japan? There's only 3 that do that in Scotland. So I don't know. Is that it's?
Yes. I know. So in Scotland, when you see that, it's always Ronnie. What's his last name? I forgot his last name. Who's servicing those Porteous stills? So I actually asked Nakamura-san about that, and so they said that so they bought some of the equipment, like for example the mash tun and so on, from Miyake, so which is a local, kind of the Japanese equivalent of Forsyths, and so they get them to service the mill, but they've only been distilling for 3 years. So they're and also at Karuizawa, it was only used for a few years at Karuizawa Distillery, and then it wasn't used for close to 20 years. So it hasn't seen a lot of action, to be honest. That port is still so. Yeah. And so the reason why Shizuoka Distillery is just like Asaka and Tsunuki started distilling at the same time. The reason why there's no Shizuoka the first yet is because, you can see that's the first barrel there. So 2016, December 9th, is because until July 2017, he was just working with the Karuizawa still, using it as a wash still and a spirit still, while he was waiting for the 2 foresight still to come. And so he wants to release a Shizuoka the first that uses distillate from all 3 stills. So that's why there hasn't been one yet. But the plan is probably at the end of this year or early next year, there'll be a Shizuoka the first. Yeah. So, and those are the 3, I think, in my view, the most interesting distilleries of that first post Chichibu wave.
Yeah. So I mean, and that's a good point. These are either distilleries that have released their first through this era or are, about to. So even if you miss the first, and obviously the first is always going to carry a certain level of rarity and demand and all that sort of stuff, and God knows how many bottles are actually going to be opened. But these are sort of, ones that, the next releases as well you should be looking at. But as you say, moving on now to what you call the second wave, essentially, which I guess we're probably waiting a little while for these ones.
Yeah. So some of these distilleries, this one started distilling about a year and 10 months ago. Yuza Distillery. This is a distillery that I have a soft spot for. I love what they're doing there. Again, a very interesting story. So this is located in Yamagata Prefecture. Very interesting place, very cold, very inhospitable place. But, the population of Japan is rapidly declining. But Yamagata Prefecture is actually a prefecture where that's expected to be, the rapidest decline in Japan. So the prognosis is that over the next 30 years, the population will drop by 30% there. And so Kinryu is a company that makes neutral spirit for sake producers. There's a lot of high quality sake producers in Yamagata Prefecture. And neutral spirit is added to most sakes to improve flavor or to stretch volume, depending on who you ask. But and so Kinryu was set up as a cooperative, as a joint venture of 9 local sake producers, and then they moved into making shochu as well. And they only sell in their home markets in Yamagata Prefecture. And shochu consumption is also rapidly declining. So they saw that in 20 years from now, they were going to be in trouble with them selling all their products in their home markets, 30% less population, shochu declining. So they thought, well, the time to act is now. And so they set up a distillery. They looked towards whiskey, obviously inspired by the example of Ichiro and the first wave of those post-Chichibu distilleries. And this is one distillery where, if you look at it, this is straight out of Scotland. Everything comes from Forsyths except the wooden washbacks, which were made by a local maker. But, straight out of Scotland, everything's, and the reason why they went with Forsyths rather than Miyake, this local coppersmith, is that Miyake is basically, they come in, they set up the equipment and they leave. Whereas Forsyths, they come in, they set up the equipment and then they teach you how to make whiskey. And so the people at Yuza there said, well, this is what we need. We can't just have them drop off the equipment and leave. So they went with Forsyths and ordered everything there. And they ordered 2 young ladies straight out of university to make whiskey there. So, the mash woman is in her early 20s, and the still woman here is in her early 20s. And their vision, basically, they've got this acronym, which doesn't really roll off the tongue. I don't know what they were thinking, but it's TLAS. Obviously, they couldn't go with plus, trust, in Japanese, trust. So they couldn't go with other options like last or salt or things like that. So they made it TLAS. And so T stands for tiny. They can only do 3 barrels a day. A stands for authentic, because even though, for example, sake consumption is declining in Japan, they noticed that producers of authentic sake were surviving because, you know, they stuck to quality, high quality. And so they have the same feeling about whiskeys that, you know, if you make whiskey in an authentic way, the way they interpret that, you'll survive. And then S stands for supreme. So unlike most of the craft distillers, they won't import any bulk whiskey. They won't produce any blends. They're just, you know, focusing on producing a good single malt whiskey. And then L stands for lovely, because, you know, it's very dark and cold there in Yamagata. You know, I've been there. You know, people wear dark clothes. Their eyes are cast down as they're walking into the wind and so on. So they wanted to have this distillery with that bright red, kind of red of phone boxes that you see in the UK, so that people in that landscape feel, oh, there's something special going on there. And so, so I asked them many questions that I usually ask when I visit these new distilleries, like, any plans for, you know, like local Mizunara or, you know, different yeasts, different this, different that. And they were like, no, you know, we just want to make a very good spirit. And there's a lot of pressure because sake producers are held in high regard in Yamagata Prefecture. So those sake producers said to them, yeah, we're fine with you setting up a whiskey distillery here, but, you know, we've got the flag flying high in sake. They win competitions all the time. So we don't want you to cut any corners. You know, we want you to be part of this, you know, this landscape in which high quality liquor is made. And so they're waiting until it's ready. Obviously, it's early days, and the analogy is not, you know, exact, but to me, I hope they'll be like the Japanese DAF mill. Obviously, they don't grow their own barley, but they've got, you know, a lot of the mindset is very similar, I feel. So I've got very high hopes for them. Like I said, they just started distilling under 2 years ago, so it's still early days. But I've tasted some of their new make and was very impressed. Yeah. So
yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that sort of thing because, you know, obviously, and I can only speak from Australia and what we do in the oak barrel, but there's a real interest in Japanese culture in general. So, you know, the drink, the food, and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, we're seeing a big increase in, you know, sake and yuzushu and umeshu consumption and Japanese beer as well. And certainly, you know, as we move on to the next one, Hitachino, often we can't get enough of it as a beer.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very interesting one. People are going to be surprised what comes out of this distillery. This is Yasato Distillery. So not many people have been in there. I managed to get in before the pandemic hit Japan. Obviously, I didn't know that was going to happen, but so it's at the foot of Mount Tsukuba. That's the view out of the window there. And they got this old community center that they remodeled. And so Kiyuchi Shizuo, again, they've got a background in sake making, almost 200 years. But when regulations for craft beer were relaxed in Japan, they were one of the first to enter that field. And so this company is run by two brothers. And, you know, the thing they hate most of all is copying something that's being done elsewhere. So when they entered the field of craft beer, most of the craft beer producers in Japan were copying German styles. And they were like, no, we don't want to do that. We want to do our own thing. And you know, they're now in so many markets around the world. So they must have been doing something right with the beer. And so then in 2016 they started making whiskey. Basically, they started not to jump on the bandwagon, but because they were using some local barley to make some of their beers. And some of the barley just wasn't good enough to make beer, so they wanted to distill it into whiskey, and they set up a tiny distillery in one of their brew houses. That's not it. That's not what you see. But then they started working on a much bigger distillery, Yasato Distillery, and they just started making whiskey a few months ago. And this is very interesting because they sourced their equipment from all over the world, which, you know, you would think is kind of a nightmare, but to them it makes sense, you know. And I spoke to Toshiyuki Kiyuchi, one of the brothers, and he said, "Oh, setting up a distillery compared with setting up a brewery is child's play, you know." And basic, but it makes sense. So the reason why they did that is because they want to use many different types of grain. It's like unmalted local wheat, buckwheat. They're speaking to corn producers, rice, a side product of sake production. Milling when you mill the rice and so on. So they want to use all these different types of grains, and so they can either be sent through the mill or sent straight into the hopper. Depending on what they're using. The rice bran doesn't need to be milled anymore. And so then again, they've got a mash tun and a lauter tun, and the mash tun has a steam jacket so that it can accommodate different temperatures for different grains. Then the washbacks, they've got a couple of stainless steel washbacks outside, again with jackets, because it gets very hot there in the summer. But then inside they have 4 wooden washbacks sourced from Garbelotto, and 2 of them are mixed oak, Slavonian and French, and the other 2 are French acacia. Then not on the pictures, but they've got 5 yeast propagation tanks, because they have many different yeast strains in-house, because, well, they make sake, they make beer, they make other types of liqueur and so on. So they're working on that. The only thing that's straight out of Scotland is the still room. So the stills were ordered from 4 sites, and they went with a very simple shape, because they're already playing with so many parameters. And but they're very big stills. They're some of the biggest among the craft producers in Japan. For maturation, so the owners of the company, they're big fans of Macallan. So their main focus, unlike most of the craft distillers, is ex-sherry wood, because again, so they have a distributor in Spain for their beers that they have a close connection with. So easy to get good quality ex-sherry casks. So this is a very, very interesting distillery. But like I said, they just started. It will be possible to visit the distillery after the pandemic, whenever that is. And they have some samples of whiskeys made at their other distillery, the small distillery, probably on the next slide, at Nonjatta Distillery. So Nonjatta Distillery is just basically a very small hybrid still that they have in one of their brew houses. But they've got different cask samples to try.
There's something very rock star about black barrels. I'm a big fan of that. I think they look very cool from that other slide there. I like that a lot.
Yeah. And so there you see the head distiller.
It's either just me or just Stefan. We've lost just briefly there. We'll just check in. Try and check if it's me or... Stefan, you there?
Take their own style of whiskey, want to find their own path, try many different directions and see what works for them. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. I think we just lost you there for a second, but we've got you back, so that's all good. Yeah, I mean, and I guess, if anyone's drinking along at home, and particularly if you got the 2 samples, you had the double distilleries and the peated 2018, the 10th anniversary. These all, you keep mentioning the post Chichibu and Ichiro. Those are 2 whiskeys that have inspired a lot. That's what's going on here. So, those 2 whiskeys, you probably taste a little bit of the same DNA and the same innovation coming through there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the double distilleries, which is the green leaf label, is my favorite of the 3 leaf labels. So there's also Mizunara Wood Reserve and a Wine Wood Reserve. And so Ichiro has said to me, so he said basically it's like a single malt. It doesn't say single malt on the label, but it's mostly Chichibu in there and a little bit of Hanyu. And I had the chance to try one of the first bottlings of double distilleries from way back from 10 years ago. And obviously then, at that point, it was mostly Hanyu that was in the blend. Now, unfortunately not, it's less than 10%. But
and I think we might have just lost Stefan very quickly there, but seems to be coming back reasonably slowly. But I mean, if anyone's drinking anything at home, let us know what you're on.
Sells for something like 35 Australian dollars per bottle. So, which, if you think about it, for a blend of Chichibu and Hanyu is not bad. Yeah. And the peated, I'm a big fan of Chichibu peated whiskey. I finished my bottle of that, so I have a different one here, which is a single cask done for a bar in London. But yeah, so what I love about most of the peated whiskeys coming out of Chichibu is that they're not one dimensional. There's a lot going on, yeah, to me they're unmistakably Chichibu. I did a tasting recently online here in Japan, and most people actually preferred the peated Chichibu over the non-peated Chichibu. Obviously, that may have just been the selection that we had then. But for the one that people are trying, so they felt that the bottling strength of 55.5 was the best one to express that particular whiskey. So they had a whole range of samples lined up at different ABVs in small increments, and that was chosen as expressing the whiskey.
As we continue to go through these last couple that we get to talk about today, I mean, are many people in this craft distillery world doing like very heavily pitted run? You mentioned a couple are doing sort of like one week or 1 month a year, or
Scott, your timing is impeccable because
how's that for a segue?
Because Saburomaru Distillery is the only distillery in Japan specializing in heavily peated whiskey. So that's what's on the screen now. And so they specialize in 50 ppm heavily peated whiskey. And, they've had a very interesting past as well, where they were using basically tanks. You see on the right-hand side, so that's basically a sake tank that was repurposed into a washback. With a little switcher placed on top. The whole distillery was like that, was just basically DIY until recently. And they had an alumite pot still, just one. And they used an old sake tank as their mash tun. And they brought in the barley already milled. And from the attic, they just poured it into that tank, which, created a cloud of flour on the attic. It was all very DIY, all very... yeah. I don't want to be rude. Anyway, then one of the younger guys from the company took control of the whiskey side of the business. Again, this is a sake producer traditionally. And so he set up some crowdfunding and so on. And this, interestingly, so what you see there, so they're based near Takaoka in Toyama Prefecture. And Takaoka has been a center of copper production in Japan for the past 400 years. So they said, well, we've got the copper here, we've got the tradition here. The thing is, the tradition there is cast copper, not hammered. But so they worked together with a local university. And what you see on the left-hand side there, they made 3 tiny stills. So the left one, stainless steel, the middle one,
I think we might have just the old Tokyo internet's being a little bit funny tonight, but we'll get him back as soon as we can. But yeah, the top one's in the top left-hand corner there with the, there's tiny stills and then there's tiny stills.
Stainless steel mini still and the stainless steel condenser, they were out immediately as they expected. But they found that actually using the cast copper mini with the copper condenser was better than using it with the hammered copper mini still and the copper condenser because the spirit was less fainty, less meaty, which is what they wanted. And so they asked one of the local producers called Oigo Works, who make huge temple bells up to like 50 tons, copper cast temple bells, to make stills for them. And basically they use these molds that you see bottom on the left. And this took about 6 months to make. But the walls are much thicker. So,
Yeah, so sorry, we just, again, the old Tokyo internet. But that is a fascinating little setup. You've got the beaten copper and the cast copper alongside the stainless steel. And we'll just wait. It's normally about 10 seconds until Stefan comes back onto the chat.
The new make made with their previous still, and then the new make made with this, and it's a world of difference. And very, very good new make now with these cast copper stills. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, excellent. So I think we just lost you very quickly in the middle there. So it's stainless and then cast copper.
Cast copper and then hammered copper.
Yeah, which is what people will be familiar with. Yeah, cool.
And then they're also using local Mizunara, Toyama Mizunara, for some of their cans, not all of them. This is something that a lot of producers are looking into to differentiate themselves, using local Mizunara. And again, the example of Ichiro, which you will see in some of the slides to come. And then one of the most promising distilleries is Chichibu 2, which I think is probably the next slide.
Yeah, another good segue.
Yeah, and so there it is. It's not a very pretty distillery. So again, not made with the visitor experience in mind. So if people are hoping to be able to visit, it's not going to be possible. Which is kind of a missed opportunity, I think. If I were Ichiro, I would have hired someone to do tours and set up something. But so no visitors again at Chichibu Distillery number 2. But I've put a comparison of Chichibu 1 and Chichibu 2 on some of the slides to come. So basically, Chichibu, as most people know, is a very small operation. They work in 2 shifts and they can only make about 320 liters of pure alcohol a day, which is a little over 2 barrels. And there's way more demand than that. So in 2016, Ichiro started thinking about setting up a second distillery. And so construction began in April 2018. And then in the summer of last year, they started producing. It's 5 times as big as Chichibu 1 at Chichibu 2, and quite different. So on the left, you see the mash tun at Chichibu, which for people who visited Chichibu Distillery, they'll recognize this. This is hand stirred by the staff with a paddle. But now they've got a huge, mash water tun with a side glass. With a side glass, because Ichiro wants to be able to monitor the filtration and so on by on the side glass of the mash tun. Then on the left, you see the washbacks there, which at Chichibu are all Mizunara. And basically, Ichiro wanted to keep that at his second distillery. The problem is it's impossible to find pieces of wood that are that size in Mizunara. So he switched to French oak and had those made by Taranso. And at the moment, there's 5 French oak wooden washbacks, but there's room for a few more. The idea being that at the moment he'll work with 1 shift, but then in the future maybe move towards 2 shifts and then add a few more washbacks. And so they're huge at Chichibu 2, as you can see, 15,000 liters capacity and filled with 10,000 liters. Yeah.
Is it far from distillery number 1? Chichibu
No,
1?
It's a 3-minute drive by car. So,
yeah.
So people thought, so just like with Mars, where their 2 distilleries are very different settings, and same with Suntory and Nikka, people were a bit, surprised by that. but he wanted to keep a lot of things the same. Ichiro doesn't like varying a lot of things. Even before he had Chichibu 2, at Chichibu he's only using one yeast strain. He doesn't like to go crazy and vary all the parameters too much. So even between his two distilleries, he didn't want to vary too many things. So like I said, he wanted to have Mizunara washbacks at the second one too, but he couldn't because of the size. But the stills, if you look at them, they're exactly the same shape. Obviously, at Chichibu 2, they're bigger, but the shape is the same. The line arm is the same, for people who are curious, 12 degrees downwards.
Look, I think the old Tokyo internet, unless it's the old Sydney internet letting me down and I'm talking to myself. But you can see in the image on the left, definitely that descending line arm, and it's a little bit more right angle, but I reckon that's actually an illusion of the image on that top one there.
The yeast is the same. It's the same people making the whiskey. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Stefan, a question from the audience again from Ben in terms of similarities between 1 and 2. Do you wear slippers at Chichibu number 2?
Yes. Yeah. They kept that the same too. The slippers stayed at Chichibu 2. Yeah. Nice one. And so, this is a very interesting picture there. So you can see the wash still of Chichibu 2. And obviously heating, direct heat it's harder to control. So Ichiro had these side glasses mounted on the still, but they're at an angle so that if you're standing where you're controlling the temperature, you have, because of the backlight, you can easily see, when it starts rising. And
yeah, we're just talking about those mirrors there. Well, obviously, it's empty at the moment, but when that's distilling, you'd actually be able to see, vapors and levels come through because of the windows out the back there, and that's that's very interesting in the terms of
completely different. So everything's the same, even the barley variety is the same there. So Chichibu 2 is much more robust, much more expensive. So it'll be interesting to see how that matures.
Yeah. So we just lost you for a couple of seconds there. Have you tasted the new make from Chichibu 2?
Yes. Yeah.
And and in terms of like the similarities of production, does that translate into flavor?
So no, it's very different, which kind of validates Ichiro's thinking that you don't need to vary too many things. You vary some carefully chosen parameters, and then you can get a very distinct difference in flavor. So maybe it's the novelty, but I prefer the Chichibu 2 new make. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. And that's Chichibu cooperage there, just to show how much thought goes into making that whiskey. That's local Mizunara there. So Mizunara sourced from the Chichibu area, and that's drying for 3 years. That's being made into staves at his cooperage there. And then on the next slide, so he's got 2 guys working in the cooperage, 2 young guys, and of that local Chichibu Mizunara, they made about 10 casks, and you can see the picture at the bottom.
Just in the bottom right there. While we wait for Stefan, Georgia comments on the Facebook. Must be the sharks chewing on the undersea cable that's caused it. It might be the heat in Tokyo at the moment. It's about 35 degrees there apparently. So maybe the air conditioning is pumping so hard at Stefan's place it's using up all the power and stealing a bit of the internet.
And we'll see in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, we just lost you there for a little bit. I think maybe the heat's knocking out the internet a little bit. But so do you want to just quickly recap because there's not many distilleries that have their own cooperage to play with. So it's actually fascinating to see that process happening, and there's the rings there and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So 2 young guys take care of that. So one guy who was trained by an old master cooper who was retiring, and Ichiro bought all of his equipment. So that's how he got all of that equipment there. And then another guy who came from the world of making casks for shochu producers, and those two guys spend their days making Mizunara cask, because basically no one else can do that. There's one cooperage in Japan where they make Mizunara casks, but Ichiro wasn't happy with the quality, and so he says, well, it's hard to do. So if it's easy to do, anyone can do it. So it's hard to do. So that's why we do it ourselves. And like I said, so Chichibu, local Mizunara sourced from Chichibu, it takes years to get to that point where where the logs can be made into staves, and then where the staves can be made into casks, and where the casks don't leak. And so Ichiro said, I don't want to calculate the cost involved in making one of these casks, because if I would do that, I'm sure I would stop. But he says it's a kind of, research and development. So, yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating. One thing that I want to tell you, and, for everyone who's been drinking along with this, I actually sent away a little bit more of what I was thinking. So I actually went through, I only had a dribble left of the peated in the double distillery. So I had to go into a little bit of, I had half a shot left in a Yama 18 bottling. But I think there's an element, particularly in Australia, with the prices going through the roof and people keep paying the prices, so they keep rising, that there's almost a bit of fatigue with Japanese whiskey, particularly when we don't see a lot. It comes and goes. But, this is what we've seen tonight is a really good example of, the excitement coming through. For someone like yourself, I mean, we're again on the auxiliary of it. Do you ever suffer that little bit of, fatigue of, I can't get access to that, or that's stupidly expensive and that sort of stuff? And like, are these new distilleries enough to keep you excited?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So I share that fatigue, and so most of what I drink these days is Scotch whiskey, which is my first love, and whiskeys from other parts of the world, because it's so hard to get hold of Japanese whiskeys, and it's such a tiring game. It requires a lot of networking and a lot of being online with your clicking finger ready, and then you're competing against people that have programmed bots and things like that, and it's very demotivating. The thing that's different for me is that I see all these things that are happening on the ground at these distilleries. So most of the distilleries that I've talked about today, well, there's nothing to try yet. There's they haven't got any product out yet, and so on. So, but I know they're working on it. So I've got good hopes that 5, 6, 7, 10 years from now, there'll be a lot of variety, and there's more distilleries being set up.
Yeah, we'll just wait for him to come back there. I mean, it might be me dropping me out all the time, but I assume he's still getting messages and other things seem to be working. So we'll just wait. But I think that's a really good point. Is keep the faith when it comes to Japanese whiskey, in terms of, yes, it's very hard.
So I know that there's a lot of motivated people doing it for the right reasons, working on that for the future. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I mean, I think we said we'd speak for about an hour, and we've gone well over that. But I mean, there's just a couple of comments coming through that I wouldn't mind mentioning it. And Thomas Sutton, who I know is a big sake fan, and sort of makes the comment that our distilleries learning the lessons from sake breweries who have become stuck, unable to accommodate visitor centres and tours and that sort of stuff because of building and plant issues, whether it's just like pure logistics or safety or hygiene or whatever. Are people who haven't put that visitor centre idea in place, do you think they will still be able to down the line, or are they,
Japanese whiskey producers are spoiled. Elsewhere in the world, distilleries have brand ambassadors, and these people make efforts to introduce their product to people. They set up tastings and stuff like that. Here in Japan,
I think it was about to say it sells as soon as it is released, which is, what he was saying before about, there's the quickest, mouse clicker in the West. It doesn't matter if someone's got a bot built to sneak these up.
You can see the old continuous still that they used there in the old days. There's the old family house and so on at Tsunuki. Likewise, Shizuoka. Beautifully designed distillery, but most distilleries, so as Thomas says, they don't think about that, and to me that's a missed opportunity. There's even one distillery, I won't mention it because I like to be enthusiastic and positive about distilleries. They're all doing their best for the most part. But one distillery where the person leading comes from a dairy background that's being treated as a laboratory. So I haven't even been in there. I haven't been allowed in. And I think of when I was at Springbank Distillery, yeah, it was a little different. They don't seem to mind a little dirt, and it doesn't seem to harm their whiskey too much there. So yeah, so I think some missed opportunities there for maybe the wrong reasons. Yeah,
bit of dirt, a few cobwebs. Never heard of Scotch, I don't believe. Yeah. Well, look, Stefan, thank you for that insight. There's distilleries there that I had read in name only, but never, knew anything about, let alone seen pictures of it. There's a couple there that I've never heard of before. So, absolutely fascinating. Hopefully, and it's, enough enthusiasm to keep the faith in 10 years, when everyone's back, and, we'll see presumably a bit of a recorrection of the market and that sort of stuff. But yeah, if there's a whiskey on the market, and this is the question I'm going to sort of leave you with, whiskey on the market that you can readily get available, is there a go-to for you of a Japanese whiskey?
Well, so I'm not just saying that because it's part of the...
I'm hoping that when he comes back, it's going to continue from exactly where it was, but it seems to be about 15-second breaks at the moment, but we'll just wait for him to jump back in, wait for Tokyo Internet to keep
available. Something that's always available. It's hard. There's not much at the moment. Yeah. But the double distilleries is whiskey, yeah, I think, and good value for money. But other than that, it's all limited releases and just trying your best and getting hold of a bottle,
And yeah, I do have to thank you on a personal level for introducing me to different distilleries over there. And even before we had met through the Ghost series at Nonjatta, I don't think I would have ever tried or owned a Kawasaki without that sort of thing. So Kawasaki be an old grain, bit of a mythical grain distillery, that sort of stuff. So, and I've got one of them. I've got a bit of time slip, but I'm still waiting for a chance we can all be in the same room and open them all together.
That would be wonderful, yeah, because I have very fond memories of my time at the Oak Barrel now 2.5 years ago. So I can't wait to be back and physically there after we're
and we'd love to.
The pandemic is over.
Yeah, we'd love to book you in for a physical tasting when we can do it. But
also to the people listening, ideally I would have sent some interesting bottles over. It's just impossible to get liquor out of Japan at the moment. But I promise when I'm there for a tasting, when next time I'm in Sydney, you're all invited, and I hope to see some of you live then, and be able to pour you some very interesting and rare whiskeys then.
Yeah, yes, and yeah, just finally, from Yao and Bennett on the Facebook, they're saying it was great to see you again and have a chat, even though it was only virtual. And yeah, we've seen all the comments in the Zoom. I do have a couple of bottles of the Chichibu on sale, but most importantly, I think the Whisky Rising, we looked at the future, but I'm a firm believer that if you know if you want to understand now, understand where we're going, you need to understand the past. And there's, this is my copy. I leave it at work. It's got a great history in that all that taxation and that sort of post-war is just fascinating. But yeah, even breaking down in not as many of the brand new distilleries that have popped up in the past 6 months, but all the distilleries that you can know and get access to. There's lots of information there. Right, so that's on our website at the moment, and it's on a lot of bookstores as well online if you want to go there. But Stefan, again, thank you very much. I'm going to say farewell to the to the Facebook and various streams, and have a quick chat to the people who are still left in the Zoom. But thank you, mate, and thank you everyone on Facebook for. I know it was very hard for all the Australians to have another drink and stay up till 10:30, but thank you all for pushing through that limit for us.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. And yeah, we'll be back tomorrow night for Sydney Whisky Forum with talking about Tasmanian whiskey, which is going to be